Ladies and gentlemen, we can start again with our first roundtable on the world of power. Because there is this mystery of power, right? On the one hand, we are all fascinated by power, we are in awe of power, we desire power, and at the same time we are frightened of power, we hate it, and we want to fight it. So who has power? And why is it that they have power? What's the nature, what's the psychology of power? How is the world of power, as Bernard spoke about, changing our world, and what is it that we can do to change the world of power? And why the anger, why the revolt against the world of power, as we are experiencing now at many, many places in the world? And finally, that's also one of the things to be discussed. Is there still a thing called moral power? Who has it, and what could be its impact? So, here are the people who accepted our invitation and traveled from all over the world to be here. The first one is Shah Riza. Shah is many things. She works at the World Bank, but more importantly, she's a very active person to work for civil rights in the Arabic world. Bernard-Henri Lévy, no introduction needed. Here our friend from Shanghai, he came all the way, Zhang Weiwei, and he's a political philosopher, an international foreign policy expert, and one of the people who strongly will defend his own ghost power in terminology of Bernard. Bill Fallon. Bill was already at our conference in War and Peace. He's an admiral. He was in charge of Central Command. He knows the world of power as nobody else. He has also a lot to say about global world politics. Moses Naim, probably also no introduction needed. Also a man with many qualities, but got almost world famous with his book on the end of power. Now, this is not Pankaj Mishra. This is my friend Ivan Krastev, one of the leading public intellectuals in Europe. More recently, he wrote two very important books, Disrupted Democracy and After Europe, in which he wants to analyze what's going wrong with Europe at this time. It's not Pankaj Mishra, and I have to explain very, very briefly why Pankaj Mishra is not here, because in 26 years of Nexus, it never happened to us that somebody decided not to come only a few days before the conference. And the reason he gave for me was confusing and even quite troublesome, because he then decided that he, quote unquote, cannot engage in a debate with people he fundamentally disagrees with. That's, for an intellectual, a very confusing statement. So I tried to convince him to come and to keep his commitment. I told him, look, there are many people who are also coming for you because you wrote this wonderful book on the age of anger. And then, quote unquote, he wrote me, quote, I cannot risk the scorn of the people I write for and whom I respect, end of quote. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that's a statement I can expect from a politician who wants to keep up a kind of fake image and, is curious of have to find out, can I be with those people, yes or no? Anyway, so I wish Pankaj best with his political career, and I'm all the more proud and happy that I have here 6 people around the table who are not representing anything but themselves and who will fearlessly speak their own mind. Please give a warm applause to all of them. Okay. Well, talking about revolutions, I think we should not forget our dear friend Karl Marx, who is also on his gravestone famously said, the intellectuals, the philosophers, they only have interpreted the world, but the point, however, is to change it. But with all respect to dear Karl, I think he was wrong, because first you have to understand the world, how it is. And then, you can think about your strategy, how to change it. So let's use, almost 2 hours we have, trying to get an understanding of what this world of power you spoke about, what it is, what is the nature of power, who has it, etc. And when I was, preparing of, my notes for, what I think we should talk about, I saw again that wonderful novel War and Peace of Tolstoy, which, Bill, you may remember, we talked about also when we had our conference on War and Peace. And it's not only about war and peace. It is about what the world of power is all about. And then there is this beautiful episode of Prince Andrei wounded at the battlefield of Austerlitz. And then on his horse there is Napoleon, the emperor, whom he also always considered to be his big hero. And then in an insight he realizes what an insignificant creature this Napoleon is. What an empty, vain, empty man he is. And there is this strange paradox that on the one hand we love movies about power and we are fascinated by powerful people, but how often are those people empty people, insignificant creatures? Now, Bill, maybe you can open our conversation, because in your career you have been serving the Napoleons of our time. The American president is still considered to be, quote unquote, the most powerful man, still a man on earth. You worked with George H. Bush, Clinton. What's your take on this? How is it possible that we can, first of all, was Prince Andrei right or was he wrong? Napoleon's Napoleon. Or how is it possible that we can have this fascination with power, but that the people in power are not often that great men or women?
So I think we have a tendency to personalize power, to see power in the manifestation of individuals. And I believe that the concept is much deeper, much more broad than that. For example, there are many kinds of power. There's economic power, political power, military, moral, and so forth and so on. I think that we try to often simplify these ideas. And again, this turning power into a person, or seeing a person and making that emblematic of power. In our introductory lecture this morning, Mr. Levy gave us an interesting portrait of the world through his eyes. And I found it very challenging, inspiring in many ways. I salute you for your presentation. It was obviously very passionate and touched on a lot of aspects of today's world and then some history. I do not agree with some of your points at all. But back to the question of power, it seems to me that in this world, power can be a force for very good things when employed and used and understood, and then it can also be the opposite. But one of the concepts that I believe is fundamental to this is that power just doesn't arrive and appear as some new gift. We collectively, as humans, actually, I think, bestow a lot of this power on the institutions or individuals that we envision that wield this power. So it's not just something from the outside that arises and takes dominance.
But Bill, what do you think should make us feel confident to a world of power or to the power elite? Because one of the eloquent points Bernard made was, how often in our history a power world, which is supposed to be a power for the good, is betraying its own ideas and own values. That's one thing. And secondly, and Moses wrote about it, and Ivan wrote about it. Are we mistaken about what the real power is? Is, quote unquote, the American president, is that a media thing that he's the most powerful? Or is he? Listen, where is the world of power? Where is nowadays world of power? Moses.
So power has not changed. Power is the capacity of one individual or organization to get another individual organization to do or stop doing something. So that has not changed. What has changed deeply, profoundly, are the sources of power. The way power is exerted, the way power is constrained, the way power is gained and lost. In the 21st century, power has become easier to acquire, harder to use, and easier to lose. And you see a lot of examples.
But do you think that this guy of Facebook and those Google boys really think that they can lose their power?
You know, if we had this conversation 5 years ago, we would not be talking about Microsoft. We will be talking about Microsoft rather. Now we're talking about Google and Facebook. 5 years ago, we would be talking and everybody was worried about Microsoft. So all I'm saying is, of course, these are I'm not denying that they are very powerful centers of power. All I'm saying is that power is becoming more fleeting, is that there's more constraint. And, you know, we see constant rotations in those who held power. Power is becoming less permanent. And so you asked, where is power today? And it's everywhere. There is far more centers of power, centers of veto, that limit what the main players can do than in the past.
My position is much easier because the best ways to define power is when you don't have it. And from this point of view, the Bulgarian position is good. We never abuse power. But I'll try to make just 3 very brief points. First is on what you were reading in War and Peace, because this is part of the Western dilemma. You have Knyaz Bolkonsky being there, somebody who is fascinated with the idea of the French Revolution and Napoleon, but he's fighting him, being a Russian officer. So from this point of view, the fact that somebody is going to be influenced by you does not mean that he's going to be on the same army with you. And from this point of view, the very idea that democratization of the world is going to end up in the pro-Western world, in my view, was one of the major illusions that people were talking about. Everything that you see in a certain way is the result of the democratization of the world, but different people. Secondly, and for me this is also quite important, you have 2 different ways to try to deal with power. One is to pretend that you are more powerful than you are. And it's a classic authoritarian game. You pretend that you control everything, knowing very well that you don't. But now you start to see in the democracies the opposite game. Now the democratic governments govern by pretending that they're much weaker than they are. If you basically talk to the democratic politicians these days, they're competing to tell you that they cannot do anything. I cannot do this because of the market, I cannot do this before of the courts, and so on. And to be honest, part of the support for the populist parties come to the fact they said, we want something who at least says that he can do something. And I do believe this is quite important because this also explains, and this is my third and last point on this, why the conspiracy theories are so spreading all over. People don't have the feeling that they know where power is, because power is not where it used to be. So you say, okay, if the governments are so weak, where is the power? Is it Facebook? Or is it something else? And I believe from this point of view, there is a strange story. The world is more transparent than it used to be, but as a result of it, the conspiracy theories are basically spreading better. So probably there is nothing more suspicious than transparency of power.
But Ivan, is because you talk about the democratization of power, is present-day populism, is that the salvation of our democracy because, finally the people stand up, or is it just a version of the dictatorship of the proletariat?
Well, listen, in a certain way, the problem is that, of course, what you're seeing is that empowering of the people, and Plato knew it very well, does not need to end up in a better society. So from this point of view, what makes our democracies different was the self-constraining nature of the democratic power. But also you have the other paradox, which is interesting. Listen, paradoxically, because of many things, starting with the fact that people have much more choices, because of technology and so on, the individual is more powerful than it was, but exactly because he is more powerful than it is, at least in the Western world, the collective action is much more difficult. Because you have the feeling that you can make a change without needing others. And this is why people whom you're going to see on the street protesting against something are not the same people who are going to vote on the elections. Paradoxically, we have this big protest in Bulgaria some years ago, and the major demand was new elections. But 60% of the people who asked for new elections, they said they are not going to vote for them because there is nobody to vote for. And this is part of this paradox of empowerment, which is not producing a kind of a much more democratic society.
Okay, but one thing I do not get yet is that if the world is as it is, that relates to how the world of power is as it is, right? So if the world is as it is, and it's in many ways a world in crisis and chaos and whatever, what does that say about the powers which are there? What is the responsibility of those people? What is going on in the world of power that we can have this chaotic situation in which we are now?
But this is an interesting story, because in his talk, Bernard Levy said, if only the Americans can stand behind the Kurds, and I have a huge sympathy for the Kurds, the world is going to be a different place. But listen, they stayed behind the Iraqis. And in a certain way, what you're calling the proxy army of Iraq was the result of an intervention. So from this point of view, to believe that to intervene is the only way to change the world is also different, because it becomes totally contextual. We end up with the world in which you have only isolationists and interventionists. And there are places in which you can intervene, there are places in which you cannot do it, but there's a certain type of a local context. And from this point of view, you cannot reduce politics to moral judgments. And I do believe this is happening, and strangely enough, we have been living in the world which there was a surplus of power on the American side. And of course, there was a decline of power. Others are coming, by the way, others are going to face some of the same dilemmas that the Americans have been facing. When you're more powerful, you're always blamed for two things: that you intervene and that you don't intervene. And from this point of view, till now, this was only the American problem. Now this is going to be the problem for the Chinese. They're going to be blamed for anything that they're doing because they look much more powerful than yesterday. And secondly, when you talk power, and this was mentioned also by Moses, do you know this children's game of skeezer, stone, and paper? This is what happened to power.
Explain.
Okay, there is a famous children's game, for those of you who do not have children on a young age, just to remind. Basically, the game is the following. Skeezer is beating the paper, but paper is beating the stone. So you are playing, and two of you, and one of them is saying stone, the other is saying basically paper. So this is also what's happened is the modern power. You have economic power, you have soft power, you have hard power. And from this point of view, depending on the conflict, certain things works differently. For example, European Union managed to convince itself that military power doesn't matter. For the last 10 years, we're telling ourselves it doesn't matter. What really matters is soft power. Okay, then came the Ukrainian crisis, and it happens that hard power matters too. The same story about economic power and military power, but it does not mean that military power can solve any problem. In his book, basically, Moses is quoting a Harvard survey, which I found absolutely fascinating. In the period 1815 to 900, anytime when you clash between asymmetrical powers, one of them being much stronger in military and economic terms, in almost 80% of the case, the stronger power is prevailing. In the last 50 years, in 55% of the cases, the weaker power manages to realize at least some of its key objectives. So it's not simply that we don't know very much what power is and where it is. We don't know very much what it means to be powerful these days. Of course, America is super powerful. Does it mean that it can solve any problems in the world? No.
I'm struck with two thoughts here. 200 thoughts. 2,000. First is that we're dealing with fundamentally human behavior. And this isn't changing throughout recorded history. Therefore, we ought to not discard the history, but go back and look at it and see what decisions have been made, actions taken, and so forth. And we can learn and maybe help ourselves in future decisions. The other thing is, the word I haven't heard yet, but perceptions. So the perception of power, the perception of whether it's an individual or a state or whatever, doing things is not necessarily the same I would say even around this table. So, Monsieur Levy, today you said something that, first of all, again, you inspired me to look at behaviors in the world and to think about what we have done, failed to do, and could do. But you used the term many times, and you said, everyone knows. I have to relate a personal experience. When I retired from the military and I spent a year in academia, I was struck by a similar term being used by a number of professors or lecturers. And the term that I heard quite frequently was, you know. And after hearing this for a while, as soon as I heard the term, I used to tense a bit, because often what followed wasn't what I knew, and it wasn't what I had seen. And in some cases, I'd actually been there and seen that, in some cases done it, so I was a little put off by this. But the point is that I believe we have our own visions, all of us, each of us as human beings, of what's going on. And one of the challenges for those who would aspire to power, to use it in good ways, is the reality that you need to, in my opinion, get people to buy into the idea that you're trying to do something, and hopefully you're doing it for the good.
Yeah. But you see, Moses, in your book you write about we need to restore trust in government and in our political leaders. How? How?
One, we desperately need to innovate in politics and in government. Our lives have changed. In the last 20, 30 years, everything has been disrupted by innovation. Everything, since we wake up in the morning until we go to bed at night, our lives has been deeply transformed in the way we communicate, we do business, we travel, we shop, we date, we divorce, everything has been transformed by technology and in biology. We have discovered more new planets and things like that. Everything has been, innovation is everywhere, except in the way we govern ourselves. The way we govern ourselves has been stagnant, has been the same, has not been, and we see the reaction. People are reacting to it in the only way they can, which is taking to the streets. So what I think is going to happen, it's coming, is a wave of political innovation, of ways in which we govern ourselves, because the demand is there. People need it. And a lot of the anxiety that we see around, that you mentioned, this chaotic world that we don't understand and it feels threatening, has a lot to do with the fact that we don't trust politicians, we don't trust governments, we don't trust each other.
But for good reasons. For good reasons.
The good reasons are also subjected to interpretations. What you perceive as good reasons may be interpreted in different ways by others. So what I do believe is that we are beginning to see some of these innovations in the level of cities, the most interesting political developments, and that have to do with power, are happening in cities. Not in the general large-scale government, not in the multilateral organizations. It's in cities, in the mayors and the people that run cities, which a lot is happening, but not enough. You still need the innovation at the larger level.
We'll have to go to the Chinese model, which may help us. But before, Shaha, you know Washington, D.C. very well. You lived there already for a long time, but you also know the Arabic world. And when I was talking about his disappointment on American power being muted, silent, do you recognize that? Are you, like Bernard, also disappointed by the American power, or what's your take on how American power functions today?
Well, I'm not sure that I'm actually disappointed, but I feel that the disease of European impotence is moving to the United States, basically.
Oh, that's another... okay, European impotence. Yeah, okay, this European impotence, how old is it, and since when is it a thing from the 60s or 80s or?
I mean, when you look at the European interests were, I feel that the Europeans have limited themselves both politically and militarily. And they have had a relationship of dependence with the United States. I do believe that they can lead again. I'm with you on that one. They can lead again, and they must if the United States is where it is now. But I want to move from here to actually the Middle East and talk about power over there, where those who govern are scared of those whom they govern, and those who are governed are scared from the people who govern them. So who has power?
Fear on both sides.
Fear on both sides. And I think that is very important. I think the uprisings, and I don't want to call them revolutions because they're not really yet revolutions, but the uprisings in the Middle East may be a step towards changing the power structures, or at least the centers of powers, particularly in a country like Tunisia, where you see an incredible emergence of civil society, which is basically the hope for a more democratic Tunisia. I don't think the leadership is there yet. I don't think, so many years, actually, let me put it this way. For many, many years, the Arab world behaved like an abused child. It has no trust in itself or confidence in the others. It's basically the result of many years of colonialism, but also because after being brutalized under colonialism, they were brutalized by their own leadership. It's a leadership that is brutal but not powerful. In fact, their weakness is translated into brutality. But I think the uprisings have, at least for people from the Middle East and the Arab world, we had no hope. At least now we have hope. But
why? What's the hope?
Because of the stagnation for many decades. I think the stagnation has changed. I think there have been movements and shifts that may allow other forces, other possibilities to happen. For years and years and years, the Arab world has been stagnant because we cannot move forward until we liberate Palestine. And actually, most of the leadership wants to be liberated from Palestine, not to liberate Palestine. So in that sense, I think there may be some shifts that are happening that will change the centers of power in the Middle East. One hopes anyway. And it is. I mean, you can see it. It's slow, but something is happening over there.
But then talking about centers of power, Bernard used his intellectual power to have a regime change in Libya. You're from Libya, right? So Gaddafi gone, but the West gone, Europe gone, and now you have the chaos over there.
And exactly, I mean, this is something that is interesting for me because you have all of these people who have complained about American intervention in Iraq and its aftermath. Whether you intervene or you don't, like in the case of Syria, or you half-heartedly intervene, like the case of Libya, obviously there is no difference ultimately in the results. There's chaos everywhere. Syria, I mean, if I look at Libya and I say, well, if there was no intervention, what would have happened? He would have massacred everybody. There's no doubt in my mind. He would have and I worry about the old guard in many of these countries actually coming back and taking retribution against the people who rose against them. But that's. But at the same time, you look at a place, I mean, Syria, nobody wanted to intervene, it seems, and when they intervened, it was too late, too little, too late with an incredible massacre that is going on over there. So when you say that, well, look at what happened in Iraq because the Americans intervened, well, they didn't intervene in Syria, and they didn't intervene well, half intervened in Libya, but the chaos is all there. So do we intervene or don't we intervene? I mean, that is a question. what happens if we intervene? What happens when we don't intervene? My feeling is that had there been a revolution or an attempt at an uprising in Iraq, you would have seen the most incredible massacres as well. I have no doubt in my mind that.
Is then the conclusion that Moses is right, that the world of power in a certain way became impotent? It's the world of power, but apparently there is not much they can do. But
can do or want to do either. I mean, Libya could have been a possible place where they could have. They went, intervened militarily, and then they hands off and leave them alone. And I remember, hearing people in the United States, which you hear different things from some people and different things from the administration. You hear some things from the military people and some things from the administration. Oh, the Libyans haven't asked us for anything. I mean, excuse me, what do you want them to ask for? On the other hand, but there were so many things that could have been done anyway, even if they didn't ask for them, on a humanitarian basis, just put in ships there with hospitals. That's one thing that they could have done without having to ask the Libyans for it. And I think the American military was a little bit more open about it. Yes, they said there were some requests, but the administration wasn't interested in any of the requests that were coming. But I want to go back to the Kurds, because that is very important. I, as an Arab who believes in the rights of the Palestinians to a Palestinian state, cannot understand any Arab who says that the Kurds are not entitled to their own state. However, I worry, because independence is not freedom. And here I want to quote, I want to relate an anecdote. When at one point I was invited to Morocco to a workshop amongst women, in particular to support the Algerian women. At the time, it was right at the worst point of the Algerian civil war, and the Islamists were really attacking the women in particular. And at the end of the 3-day workshop, everybody was very worried about the Algerian women who were going to be leaving, and everybody kept saying goodbye. And then one woman got up, and she started singing a song which North Africa used to sing when it was calling for freedom from France. And at that moment, it just hit me that before anybody else, it was Arab women who realized that independence doesn't mean freedom, and that they did not gain their freedom. And that is what I'm worried about the Kurds about, because whether one likes it or not, the same faces amongst the Kurds have been there for the past, God only knows, 30 years or 40 years, whether it is Masoud Barzani or whatever, or the Talibanis or whatever. And I fear that this whole referendum, I think, may have been a mistake at this point, and I'm not the only one saying it. Many Kurds I know are saying the same thing, but it was a way to actually deflect from what is going on internally. I do believe that I actually believe in a Kurdish state, but I think that it was a game that was badly played. Just like the Palestinians, it's a great cause with bad leaders, basically.
Yeah, well, no, otherwise, I think we should go to a really great leader, your president, right? Somebody who can give a speech for 3 hours and 25 minutes, and at least 1,000 people are listening to him. That's not possible here anymore. With the compliments of the White House, who are in retreat, they give all the space to the world of China. So will the world of China make a difference if China will be the new superpower on this planet?
Okay. Actually...
come with some good news. Why?
Now, when you talk about this uncertainty about the power in the West, it indeed has to do with the shift of power in the world from the West to the rest, notably China. And if we talk about the power in terms of soft power and hard power, what you see is clearly what I call a paradigm shift from the so-called democracy versus autocracy to good governance versus bad governance. That's what China advocates. Good governance can take the form of Western political system. There are some cases, not always. Good governance can also take the form of non-Western political system. Chinese is an example. We have many problems, but overwhelmingly speaking, it's far more positive than negative. Likewise, bad governance can take the form of the Western political system. This is crucial. I can give you 100 examples. And then bad governance, of course, can also take the non-Western political system. Behind this is a shifting hard power. From our study and calculation, and from also study of certain international organizations, China is already the largest economy in terms of purchasing power parity. We have created the world's largest middle class. We export most tourism than other countries, even combined. We have created largest property, most Chinese have properties. We have created world's largest foreign exchange reserve. Of course, these are economic powers which can have influence. And this reminds me of my debate with Professor Fukuyama, the author of The End of History, exactly 6.5 years ago, when Egyptian Spring occurred. He said to a large audience, China may also experience Arab Spring. I said, no chance. I said, on the other hand, be aware. I think Arab Spring will become Arab Winter. I checked, I may be the first intellectual in the world to make this comment. I was with Brussels think tanks last year. I said, if only European Brussels could hit to the, with my Chinese modesty, or humble advice, you could have avoided this terrible refugee crisis. 1.5 million people a year, refugees, escape from broken homeland to Europe. We could have avoided. And secondly, I also made another prediction 6.5 years ago. I said the United States and China both need political reforms. But in the case of China, small reforms have been going on all the time in the political system. We fix problems here and there. But I said, the problem is the United States. Your political system was a product of pre-industrial era. And I made a forecast. I said, without significant, substantial political reform, my concern is, in your next elections, you will produce a leader worse off than George W. Bush.
That's
So then,
Yeah.
so it was you, it was not the Russians.
Yeah. So this is the Chinese humble advice we can offer.
Yeah, listen, but let me ask you a very humble question. Why is it that you consider your system of government a good form of government, while it is a government which there are no political parties. You execute, the Chinese government executes 8,000 to 10,000 people every year. There is no rule of law. There is no objection to child labor. And basically it's a political power based on fear, right? There are no dissidents. Well, there are dissidents, but you kill them.
No. This is really, we have to be, the whole idea of good aspect of enlightenment is about rational. You have to be rational with China, with enlightenment, with the West itself. If you look at China, now we export every year 130 million tourists. 99.999% return to China. Why do they prefer to return to a country without human rights? Of course, the opposite is true. It's vast improvement of human rights. So easy to check with any Chinese you meet in Brussels, in Amsterdam, in Beijing, Shanghai, everywhere in China. It's so simple, it's common sense. The point is, what we should guard against is Western cultural arrogance. You have so many reporters based in Beijing and Shanghai. They never speak Chinese language. But we send millions of Chinese students, 85% return home. Why is they return home? Because they think, they see the future, they see the chance. So this is totally different.
But now you were wrong, it's not a ghost power. It's real power.
Well, come to this idea of ghost power. Of course, you have your freedom of speech, I respect. But China is, a civilizational state. I remember when Henry Kissinger wrote his famous book on China, he started with this quote. He said, "My goodness, look at this China. It's different. China uses this unique language, which started 3,500 years ago. It's 1,000 years earlier than ancient Greek, 1,005 years earlier than ancient Latin. But these two European languages were dead languages. Chinese are still using the same language. This line of culture and continuation of civilization, uninterrupted. So this is why we have, indeed, for instance, this whole idea of meritocracy. Why I say confident? I said with my debate with Professor Fukuyama, I said, if you look at the top leadership in China, we've just had the party's Congress, minimum requirement, 2 terms of provincial governor or similar position, which means you have to govern at least 100 million people, given the size of China, before you came to one of the top 7 positions, decision-making bodies. I said to Fukuyama, I said, with this Chinese methodology, meritocracy-based system, we can say with certainty, we can improve the system. There are problems, we can fix it. But we will not produce any leaders like George W. Bush. It's way below the Chinese bar. That's my point.
Yeah, if I could make a couple of comments. China has a phenomenal history, as I have been. It's been pointed out to me many times in China that as a people, as a nation, as a culture, in many different political manifestations, but been around for a long time, and the United States is a junior youngster on the world scene. But I'd like to maybe take us back to what I think the essence of the reason we're here, and that is that the Nexus Institute has highlighted what I interpret as a bit of a crisis in our historical aspiration and actions that have or have not followed those aspirations. So if you were to follow the logic here of we had this enlightenment and this humanistic revival, revolution of a kind in Europe, and Monsieur Levy indicated very appropriately that it migrated to the West, and he had a hope that maybe it might come back this way. And I like the ending, all is not lost. I like the optimistic outlook. But it might be worthwhile. I always try to, when I get into discussions with people from other countries, to try to focus on my own country, which I think I understand probably better than others in different places of the world. And so if you look at, as I look at America, e pluribus unum was a statement that we see every day in our currency and in many other places. And it's got an interesting history. But back to this dilemma, this supposed dilemma of the U.S. Withdrawing from the world, I would point out that through its history, the U.S. has had a bit of tension, very real tension within the country, within its people. And in fact, if you go back to the founding of the United States, in its aspirational Declaration of Independence and then enshrined in the Constitution of the country, it was formed and shaped and birthed in an attempt to break away from what was seen as historical challenges from the European system, that there was a yearning to break away from the royalty, from the bad manifestations of culture and things in Europe, and to do something different, and to be different and not to be engaged. And so this continues to this day. So it shouldn't be very surprising that within the United States you still have this very strong feeling that the rest of the world can do it at once, but we're going to try to do better. Now, I'd be happy to critique my own country. And Moises, you hit on a word, governance. I happen to think that's our biggest challenge today within our own country. We've kind of lost our ability because of these frictions, these tensions, these power centers, if you would, competing, we seem to have wandered away, and we have manifestations of that. But it's still a wonderful ideal that we share these series of values and aspirations and treatment of human beings very, very closely with particularly the Western civilization in Europe. Chinese culture and history, different era. We, all of us, except from our Chinese counterpart here, grew up in a different world. And that's the world that I think is in a bit of a crisis now. I too share the optimistic end state that we'll figure out a way out of this. But it shouldn't be surprising, because going back to the beginning, this is all about human behavior. And there isn't anything new here. And people have fears, they have hopes, they act sometimes at high levels, and other times very, very badly.
But there are also ideas. But let's, for a while, to stick with China, right? Benna, is China, is it after the explanation of Weiwei, do you still think it's a ghost power? Or do you accept his argument that it's a civilizing power to the world?
My reply is that I respect deeply, more than respect, I admire Chinese civilization. I admire Chinese history. I have been all my life an admirer of Chinese art. Since I was a very young man, China has been one of the compass of my life, but I don't admire your political system. And I find much more admirable and worth of respect a system when you have the right to make a strike, when you have the right to be paid decently, when you have the right to speak freely, when you have the right to not to be contaminated by terrible pollution, and so on. So I will not say, in the name of relativism and so on, that every political regime are equivalent. I don't believe so. I really think that Europe invented an idea which does not belong to Europe, that migrated to America, that has been adopted by a lot of parts of Latin America, that is incarnated in part of Asia, which is an universal idea, which is the idea of freedom, of equality, and so on. And China of today is not worshipping these values. And that's why I do hope, I would be happy, I would not say that with surprise or not surprise, if there was one day a real Chinese Spring, a real cultural revolution, as the one I saw in my youth, of Chinese people saying it's good to have wealth, it's good to have gross product, it's good to have exportation, but it's good also to have human rights, I think that this would be a great news for humanity. I would like also to make a few points after what has been said before. The question of your first question, is it still good? Is the place of power still the same? Is the President of America still the real leader of America and of part of the world? This is one of the new things of today. One example. Look at what happened recently, it seems, to Mark Zuckerberg, the young founder of Facebook. The idea caressed his mind to run for office. He was probably tempted to do it. He made a presidential tour all over, a pre-presidential tour all over the country. He visited every state of America. And at the end of the process, he said, "Thank you, I'm sorry, I far prefer to remain the founder of Facebook than president of America. Number one, because it's a better life, but number two, because it's a bigger power to be president of Facebook than being president of America. So this is a real new news. About the number of source of powers, this is the real question. There is the power of Mr. Zuckerberg and the power of Mr. Trump. But what the modern philosophy, the philosophy of the last decades, did teach us? Michel Foucault, for example, the name is familiar, everybody knows, I'm sorry, can I say that? Nearly everybody knows that Michel Foucault said that the power has no place, that there is no single source of power, that there is something which he calls biopower, and which is spread, disseminated all over the society, embedded in the very flesh of the language, in the very flesh of the society, in the very blood of the desire uniting or creating misunderstanding between human beings, men and women, women and men, and so on. So the source of power is absolutely disseminated. And you have a book, a great book of a man who is not my political friend, called Tony Negri and Michel Hart, called Empire, where he said, come on, he said to the anti-imperialist, come on, America imperialist, joke. China new empire, joke. No, the real empire is a sort of network of micro powers which makes the real empire. The question of Libya, Syria, this is, I don't want to let that without reply. You said, I liked a lot of things you said, but there is one thing I would like to precise. You said intervene, non-intervene, at the end of the day it is the same chaos in the two cases. Not exactly true. It's not the same to have chaos, as in Libya, and to have the worst, the biggest, one of the biggest massacres of modern times as we have in Syria. Syria is a real shame, nightmare of our generation. The 400,000 probably deaths, millions of refugees, the totality of the country emptied from its inhabitants. And why? Because of the non-intervention. So the product of intervention in Libya has not been paradise, but the product of non-intervention in Syria has been clearly hell. And this, I think, has to be said. About the Kurds, you are right to say that independence does not mean automatically freedom. True. But look at the situation between, I'm sorry, this I know a little, Iraq and Kurds. Iraq has independence, but they don't have freedom. Kurds have freedom, and they don't have independence. They have freedom. I mean, they have a parliament. They have battalions of fighters which are composed of women. They have respect for other faiths. They protect the Christians. They worship the memorials of the Jewish tradition in Iraq. They are open to the otherness. This is a tradition, a sense of freedom. Freedom is never perfect. The principle of freedom is that it is always unachieved, of course, as Rob Riemann said in his introducing remarks. But in Iraq, you have much less than that. You have a real autocracy, a real dictatorship. So, problem of the Kurds is that it is not fair that those who have no freedom or little freedom have independence, and those who have built a freedom society, a rather free society, have no right to independence. This is not fair. This is an injustice. And this is one of the reasons why I believe that this sequence of our time will remain as a dark spot in our collective memory. And about the bad leaders, yes, the last thing I wanted to say, I'm not going to enter into personalities, as a French poet, Charles Péguy, said, but nevertheless, I don't think you can say that. I believe that these Kurdish leaders who who governed their people in high sufferings, who went through genocide, as Massoud Barzani did, genocide committed by Saddam Hussein, who prevailed against Daesh, who really did defeat the leadership of Kurds, did defeat ISIS on most of the front line. I did a movie which is called Peshmerga, which will be screened, by the way, in the United Nations in a few days, under initiative of France and UK, Peshmerga, and I went all along the 1,000 kilometers of front line, and I saw that. What is the brilliant leadership? It's women and men who confronted victoriously a force which literally mesmerized the rest of the world. Everyone was stupefied by this ISIS, by the appearance of Daesh. The Iraqis escaped like rabbits, and I can understand that in front. The only one who stood firm, who did battle, and who did prevail are this Kurdish leadership, Massoud Barzani, and others, women and men. So only for this reason, I think that it is also not so fair to speak about their bad leadership.
So I want to, you said that Weiwei had this equivalence between political systems, but he does not have equivalence. He has a clear preference. He believes that authoritarian systems are superior to democracy. He explicitly said that democracy yields to bad governance, if I'm not mistaken. So my question to you, there are millions of people today in the world that live under bad governance systems, which are democracies. China has a different view, and therefore countries tend to be very tempted to export their models. They like to see what they do replicated elsewhere. So would you recommend to your government to go out in the world and promote what you think is good governance and less promote the cause of less democracy or non-democracy?
Actually, it depends on how do you define democracy. I like this Nexus Forum because you said at the very beginning, we discussed the real meaning of democracy, real democracy. But unfortunately, so far what we see, as shown in Arab Spring, about one person, one vote, a multi-party system, that's at the best procedural democracy. That's not necessarily the real democracy. Real democracy is far more important, as you said, about education, about many other important ideals. In terms of China, let me quote from everybody knows Confucius. Yeah. And he said, people are like water. Regime or leaders are like boat. Water can carry the boat, can also overturn the boat. So if you look at the China model in particular, the key message is stay in touch with your people. It's so easy. If you go to Africa, don't go there with your brilliant ideas. I respect your preference, it's understandable. But you do some surveys. What are they care about most? Fighting poverty, fighting disease, street security, safety, etc., job creation. You do this accordingly, 1, 2, 3, 4. That's how China did. We call it people's livelihood-centered model. It's working very well. And furthermore, in terms of governance, really, governance is about serious business. I remember Plato once joked. He said, "How could you, if you are sick, you are in disease, would you trust a doctor elected by people on the square, or you prefer a trained, well-grounded professional doctor?" Of course, you prefer the secondary, the latter.
It's not true, because you go on Google and this is basically self-appointed doctors.
The point is, you have to be accepted by your own people. China is a very different country. I always say China is unified.
So concretely, you do
could I
prefer the
finish?
world. You do prefer a world in an ideal situation. You would like to have a world where some of the lists of things that he said at the beginning, the right to go to a strike, the right to be, there are issues that have to do with
mentioned
freedom.
the right to strike. Yeah, actually it's the same.
Would you recommend the rest of the world to go that way and repress the options that he described?
No, it's not his definition. It's really people should sit down and discuss what kind of political system with your people. Yeah.
We're doing that.
Yeah, we should experiment. China offers an option, which is very interesting because we have the 4 decades of successful
And
experience.
in your opinion, is that China should export that view?
Xi Jinping said in his report, China's experience can offer an entirely new alternative for those countries and nations who desire for quick modernization and complete independence.
It is going to be a state-supported export.
No, it's not.
I'm joking.
Actually, Chinese are very modest. I'm being slightly less modest.
Yeah.
China do not export its model, do not advocate its model. But once you're successful, if you go to Africa, people talk about looking east. They have tried the Western model for decades, not working, So look to these.
I have a question about, and you jump in, Ivan, when you want, but about a relationship between your government and the Chinese people.
Yeah.
Recently I read about the Chinese social credit system.
Yeah.
And the Chinese social credit system is the following. You have the citizen score, which is a fusion between political and technological power, in which all data about your life, which includes the friends you have on Facebook and the books you read, are rated into a single number. The number will be made public, and so therefore everybody in the Chinese society will know whether you are trustworthy, yes or no, if you are eligible for a mortgage, a job, and so on and so forth. This is worse than 1984 of Orwell.
Let me tell you, China, I've never heard of this. First time from you. Huh?
Okay, well, because we are a free country, we can give you all the information which you don't get over there.
Garbage in, garbage out. You have to be selective. Otherwise, in this new social media, you could have all kinds of stories. China is a civilizational state. What does it mean? If you look at the size, in Europe, I made a rough calculation. A country is, in average, 14 million people. China is 1.4 billion people, 100 times larger than Europe. I make comparison. I say it's almost like a Roman Empire has continued to this day. It's vast, it's diverse, but people speak the same language called Mandarin Chinese. So it's a unified country for over 2,000 years. Then it has shaped its own conditions. For instance, for a long time, Fukuyama, I give him some credit. He said China's first country that invented modern state. What?
May I just talk here about the oppressed Muslim minority? So don't tell me that everybody is fine. There is an oppressed minority in China. And then I want to bring up something else here with it, in terms of terrible things that are happening today, like in Syria. And it's what is happening to the Rohingya Muslims. And the way I look at it is, I thought it was never again. And to me, never again meant a Muslim or a Christian or Jewish or Yazidis or black or white or any color. But today we are seeing a genocide. And I don't see, China has also quite a lot of influence in a place like Burma, like Myanmar. Apart from, I don't want to even talk about North Korea, but I don't see anybody doing anything for the Muslims in Myanmar or the Muslims in China.
Let me answer you this question first.
Yeah, no, because I do believe it's important, because in order to know, because I do believe we go in a conversation in which you are saying how good you are, we're saying that you're not very good. But in a certain way, the problem is that part of the Western democracy's also problem today is that we lost curiosity on the others. Obviously, China's legitimacy is not based on caution only. And if we're not seeing this, we're basically playing a game. But on the other side, I do believe what you're also giving is a totally uncritical story, because every political regime is successful under certain conditions and not others. I do believe one of the biggest problems that we have, we forgot what are the real advantages of democracy. The real advantage of democracy is not simply rights, but this is that when people are disappointed, you're giving them a mechanism through which they can react. Democracy is not famous for doing the right things, but democracy is famous for changing the governments that people don't like without violence. My question is the following. The Chinese system at the moment, in my view, works fine based on an incredibly important economic performance. How strong is the system if economic performance is not there? So if we want to be serious, we should be open to the vulnerability of both regimes, because otherwise we go in a rhetorical story, which probably good opera performance, but it is not helping us more. And just on Bernard-Henri Lévy, I do believe that the Spanish government should be very happy that you went to Kurdish regions and didn't end up in Catalonia at the same moment.
Could I answer? Yeah, actually, two questions for me. One is about the performance legitimacy. The other about the religious policy. Now, concerning performance legitimacy, actually, Chinese economy has gone through ups and downs over the past 4 decades, if you go back earlier. But, actually, each time when there is a crisis, it's an opportunity. We seize the crisis. The Chinese approach is very dialectical. Every crisis is also a good opportunity, and you can seize the opportunity. I think in today's world, there are fierce competitions. To my mind, United States needs reforms. European countries need reforms. China needs reforms. But actually, arguably, China is the only country that can really push for reforms, political, economic, social, substantial reforms. For instance, in the economic reform, Xi Jinping, we give him credit, he said we must embrace the new economy, the renewables. Yes, China might have brought with its cost, environmental degradation, but very soon China is the leader in terms of producing, investing renewable energies, electric cars, solar energy, wind power, etc. It's a strategic decision, no choice. If you're a leader, if you get a poor record environment protection, you're ousted. Yeah. Now, concerning religion, actually, if you look at the history of China and Europe, one striking difference is in European history, there are a lot of religious wars for over 1,000 years, if not longer. Because each religion believes, I'm the right one, only one God. If you do not believe in this religion, you are wrong. It's less tolerant, less inclusive, it's exclusive. Good or bad, we look at history honestly. In the Chinese history, one striking difference, we do not have religious wars. Buddhism, Taoism, even to a certain extent, but smaller, Islam and Confucianism, people live together on the whole harmoniously. I have many classmates from Muslim background. Even the most difficult time, we provide with special food rather than food Han Chinese eat. So I see this great tradition. But another message from the Chinese religious tradition is religion is religion. It's your belief, it's a way of life, but you cannot intervene in politics. Why, if you look at the Enlightenment, we have to be rational with the Enlightenment as well. You look at the origin of the Enlightenment. How many European giants, Voltaire, Leibniz, Dutch philosopher Spinoza, praised China for this secular, they call it natural religion. Yeah. Division between state and religion. So even today, if you have agenda, that's my concern with so-called civil rights movement sponsored by Washington, by EU, we reject this categorically. good or bad, like it or not. For us, globalization is economic globalization, not political globalization. It's not privatization, democratization. That's Russian child failed.
Okay, Benna quoted very importantly old philosophers. I would like to bring in Thucydides and his great book on the Peloponnesian War, where he makes this very blunt, I think very true statement: might makes right. If we want to understand the world of power and how the world is as it is, might make right. When you have the power, you can do whatever you want. So this probably explains also why the United States of America has no problem with Saudi Arabia or any other regime because there is oil. Why the Chinese can do whatever they want and your government can do whatever they want because there is no rule of law, might make right. At the very moment you have the power, you can do whatever you... That seems to me, if that's the prime drive of a world of power. I mean, look on these bullshitters of Facebook. You know, we are there to open up the world and whatever, and they are killing our democracy. So, how to deal with this quintessence in the world of power that might make right? I have the power, so I can do whatever I want.
You have the power, you can do whatever you want, is the opposite of democracy. Democracy means you have a power, you have in front of you someone who has a power, and the two powers have to compromise. And you must have some referees, which is some institution, who make the arbitrage between the two powers. The rule of law is the opposite of the rule of force.
But Benna, your whole brilliant opening lecture was an example that the power elites, world politics, is not interested in our democratic model. It is about might makes right. We can do it, so we do it.
Some of them are not interested, some are. It is one of the sources of the crisis of today, sure, that a growing number of the elites in the democracies don't believe in their own system, don't believe in their own values, don't believe that they have to be praised and defended. This is the problem, but it is not because some think like that we have to abandon and to quit the stage. I repeat what I heard from our friend here on my right. For me, is so strange. I heard that 20, 30 years ago by the big American companies. Globalization is only globalization of money, is only globalization of works. It should not be globalization of rights. It should not be globalization of human rights. This is the pre-historical stage of capitalism. And I think that China will not go so far as you think, and maybe as China deserves, if she stays on this path. If you really believe that the Rohingya problem is a problem of faith, if you really believe that the Uyghur problem is a problem of religion, it means that really your leadership has not understood how really a great power has to work in order to succeed, because it is a human rights question. It is a democratic subject. And it is not NGOs of the West who are, this is a plot theory, it's absurd. It is people who are in despair. The Rohingya, it's a terrible, nobody knew. Let me finish. Nobody knew in the West, except a few of us, who the Rohingya were. They are the most miserable people in the world. They have no rights. They have nearly no identity.
Have you been to that region?
No identity.
Have you been to this region? I've been there many times.
Of course I have been.
You have to see the rapid rising standards of people's life.
My friend, I have been
Yeah.
Alas, I am elder than you.
Yeah.
And I went to this
It's not
area.
age of age.
No. Wait a
Whether
minute.
you can seek truth or
I
facts.
went in this
With
area.
all these surveys, I'll give you another figure.
I spent my
The
youth.
latest
I spent my youth between Bangladesh and Burma. I know exactly what is the fate of a cursed Muslim people in this environment.
But impose
I know
a system
who
on
the
it creates
Rohingyas
more
are.
disaster.
I know that they are man deprived of any rights.
Yeah.
And I
The
know
world is
that
not
in
perfect.
front of that,
Yeah.
you cannot feel something else than despair. And they are despaired. And that's why they revolted. And the way in which they are treated is
Levy,
scandalous.
You are a Frenchman. I checked the latest
And
opinion survey.
Obviously.
Latest opinion survey by Ipsos.
Yes.
In terms of to what degree you are happy with direction of your country.
In
China,
Rohingya,
it's 89%.
Rohingya,
Yeah.
Uyghur.
No, I mean as a whole. No.
I speak
in France,
of-
12%
Okay.
cannot support the other, the 89%.
Tell me about Rohingya
No,
and
really,
Uyghur.
mind your own business first. We have many problems.
A Democrat,
but definitely,
precisely,
if we apply
to be
Western
a
model, it's a
Democrat means
disaster.
that you don't mind your own business first. This is Trump.
Improve your performance
This is
in
Donald
France
Trump.
first, your
Donald
political
Trump,
system.
America first.
Don't
This is
produce
Donald
another idiot.
We can vote now.
Mind your own business, Trump, is the line of Trump and China. Okay. Okay, mind your own business first. I don't agree.
It's 89% versus 12% satisfaction.
who dares
We
to
know the
speak in
result.
China anyway?
You know really too little about China. Little knowledge is dangerous. We have 130 million visits abroad, 3 million students
Don't attack
abroad.
me
we
about
still
my
don't
knowledge
know.
because that's not the right way to go
No,
about
even
it.
with that, we cannot agree to your interpretation.
I would like to bring in something different, which relates to this topic, and that is, Benna, again, your keynote was very much an exposition on how we have lost the value of the Enlightenment, right? And in our terms, to use power for the best, and not having this idea that might make right, etc., etc., etc. How is it possible that living in the 21st century with a great education system and free media, etc., etc., why is it that we've lost our own values of the Enlightenment, not only in the United States of America, also in Europe, and that we are now into a kind of discussion, what is the best government model, etc., etc., etc. We lost a lot of credibility. Why?
We lost a lot, yes. I hope we did not lose forever. And I really hope that...
but why did we lose it?
Because the elite lost.
Which elite? Intellectual elite?
Political elites, intellectual elites probably, because maybe the new technology introduced a new way of making the difference between truth and fake.
But we lost our values of the Enlightenment not a decade ago.
I'm not so sure, because one thing which strikes me, even today, the fact that our friend, for example, claims himself of Voltaire and Leibniz. This is very interesting. How the representative of a great country living under autocracy finds the need to claim faithfulness to Voltaire and Leibniz. This is a proof that we did not completely lost. Well, not speaking of Ipsos. Voltaire, Leibniz, and Ipsos.
With my all respect for you as a French philosopher, we have complete translation of Voltaire's works in Chinese. I myself read French. If his admiration for China, because China is not autocracy. Europe at that time was 100% autocracy. So he looked to China. The 30-year war, Germanic population lost 1/3 of its population. We look at China as the world's largest peaceful, unified empire. That's why I said we should look to China. That's the ideal. We have to be honest with the Enlightenment. If you look at Leibniz, the anecdote goes in, he said, I want to get each and every information about China. He said, please come to my office. We have knowledge about China. And he put a stick on his office, China Study Center.
This was the China of the time of Leibniz. What about the China of the time of today?
Today is much better. It's the best of China, of course. You have to ask Chinese. Yeah. That's it. With all the opinion
I want to
surveys.
bring in Bill Fallon. Bill, speak your mind.
Again, too many things, too rich a discussion, and I'm going to break my own rule here and talk about China, only two things. It's very, very clear that the government of China puts a top priority on security and stability as the fundamental prerequisite for continuing its existence of its political system. It is fundamentally anathema to me that a nation with a responsibility for 1.3 or 1.4 billion people will deny its people the opportunity to listen, to hear things, not to act. The states will make rules all over the world to govern the actions of their citizens, but to deny the citizens the opportunity to listen to other opinions and ideas, which is a reality today in China, is fundamentally different than this Western humanism that we are called to at least discuss. So I'm sorry, but that's just my view. So when you restrict the ability of people to actually hear other ideas and to make their own minds, make up their own minds, what's good, what's not, then we have a problem from our view. But I'd like to go back to, let me get off that, back to ourselves. We share some fundamental values and aspirations with Western, we, in this case, the US. So what to do? I think that different than what you proposed a few minutes ago, one of our fundamental problems is that we, in Western democracies, are almost spending too much time in the detail of who has power, who should be in charge, how do I get myself in a position to lead and to... I think that we have lost some of our educational idealism. We say we have education, we have metrics that show that a great percentage of the population, but what do people really understand? What have they learned? What have we learned from our history, first of all, and what it is that we ought to be doing with ourselves? And it seems to me that the prescription for us that we ought to seriously think about is that if we want to have good outcomes in this world, if we want to have a better world, we have our own people and the people in other countries, whether it's in the Rohingyas or people in Xinjiang or the Kurds, that we have to be engaged. We can't just step back, accept the criticism of our recent government in the US, but more than engage, you actually have to act. You have to do something. We have to act to make things happen. And then we might see outcomes that we'll be successful in. But fundamentally, I think we've backed off. Too many people, when you cite the percentages of people that are not voting, in my own country, it's appalling. And so this needs to change. How is it going to change? Only if the leaders, the elites, those who think they're educated, actually start exerting some impact on people in our own countries. And if we do that, and we begin to behave in ways that are exemplary to others, then I think good things will follow.
Bill, this is a great introduction to the final topic I would like to discuss, and that's the phenomenon of moral power. Many leaders, many elites have lost their moral authority. You know, whether it's in politics or business or the intellectual elite. And it is an old story because, you know, the might-made-right thing is there, serving self-interest, etc., etc., etc. So if we want to keep this society a more or less civilized society, Simone Weil, I wrote in my a text for this conference, has the sense of, you know, we have to change our concept of greatness. There is a kind of male concept of greatness, the great man, which has nothing to do with having any moral authority. How can we regain a sense of moral authority, who can have, should have moral power, where should it come from, and how can we change our idea of what it means to be great?
No, don't start with me.
Okay, Ivo.
Listen, on greatness, it's easier for me. Just to say the following, there is a paradox. Moral power was always very much based on the absence of other power. This was why intellectuals during the Enlightenment were powerful, because they didn't have a military power. Who is the person that is going to come first to you now when you talk moral power? The Pope. And even if you're not a Catholic, you have a person who tries to make basically change on the basis of the power of his words. I'm saying this because I do believe two things have changed and they're slightly different. The globalized world, we know each other, or at least we have this illusion better than any before because we travel, you see. But this resulted in the crisis of universalist understanding. The biggest universalist was Kant, who never left his small town. It's easier to imagine the mankind when you basically don't see it. And I'm saying this because, for example, on the genocide in Myanmar, do you know what was the biggest protest now against this? 500,000 people. Mr. Kadyrov in Chechnya. And he was saying that he's ready basically to arm people to go to defend. Listen, the problem of the human rights and rights in general cannot be simply taken as a universal right. They start to be instrumentalized here and there for different purposes. And I do believe what we have is the crisis of the universal values, not simply because people have a different alternatives than others, but because people are afraid of a cynical use of them for political purposes. And this is why to believe that the moral leaders of the world are going to be the political leaders, this is no how it was. The moral leadership was always in opposition to real power. So from this point of view, to basically blame Donald Trump that he's not the moral model, he's not Aspire, is simply going against history. So in a certain way, we should ask about ourselves what we are saying, why the people are not much more interested in the ideas coming out of politics.
So I fully agree with that. And I am more worried about ideological necrophilia. That is a passionate love for bad ideas. Ideas that have been tried and tested in different countries, in different moments, and they always end in tears. They always don't work. They generate suffering, human suffering, killings, genocide, all of that. And yet, regularly, we see how leaders adopt these very bad ideas. You know, there is a passionate love. It's necrophilia. It's of an ideological kind. And so it's a paradox that a time in which we live in a world full of information, when you can find the data, or you can find the information, still there is this proliferation of bad ideas that are accepted as good ones, even though they have been tried and that we know they don't work. I think that is closely connected with moral leadership, too.
You're talking about moral power in opposition to, and in the case of the Rohingya, I think somebody did come up with the moral power, and that's the Dalai Lama, who said if the Lord Buddha was here today, he would have saved these Muslims in Burma. And I think that is very important. So when you talk about the Pope, I'm not sure where the Pope is.
I'm not a Catholic, so
Okay. But there are people with that moral authority, and I think that is, in my view, the problem of whether if religious leaders go into in the Muslim Arab world, if religious leaders go into politics, then the two get mixed. I think it has always been in the old days that it was the religious leaders who held to account those who are governing, and one worries that now that when they want to govern, who is going to hold them accountable, basically.
Bill?
I think this is interesting and enriching the conversation, but I believe that there is a responsibility for moral leadership. There's a requirement for it. I am Catholic, so I acknowledge the moral guidance that I get from the Catholic leader, that's a force for good in my view. As with anything else, if you use it the wrong way, it becomes abusive. But I want to also make a point that we live in a real world, and the advance of technology today is something that we're not going to stop, but it should have us pause to think about how this technology is used, because it's agnostic. It's just inanimate, but can be used for good or evil. One of the challenges I see is the value, in a positive way, of a way in which we were brought up, in which this is a great example here, where people with different backgrounds, different views, sharing some things, not others, have a chance to put the things on the table and discuss it. And then for others, the greater audience in the world, in addition to ourselves, we listen to these things, we pay attention, and almost inevitably, we hear things that we didn't think about that we can learn from others. The challenge of the technology today, in my opinion, one of the weaknesses is you're reading things on a computer, you're getting a view, and it is not easy today to get another view, to ask the question, well, okay, that seems logical, it's convincing, but is that the whole story? Is this really true? And this gets the fundamental challenge of the cyber world that we ought to be concerned about, not so much destruction and evil things, but the more subtle danger of the technology influencing decision-making with an absence of all the facts and so forth. Let me take us back to the practical world. In the business of, for example, intervening, not intervening. I'll give you my own background, and that is I would not be very forward-leaning and advocating intervening unless I had a pretty good idea, I knew what the outcome was. And so it's very easy to say, let's go intervene, I found, and we've done it in my own country, without a full appreciation of the consequences and what needs to happen. So there's a reluctance from some of us who have exercised a certain kind of power to put that power in motion without having a very strong idea about what the outcome might be. And since we never know with totality, then we ought to be very judicious in advocating actions that could be unpredictable and get us to consequences we don't like. But I think the reality of, back to this power and why you called this conference, power has many aspects. They mean different things to different people. They're perceived, the actions and manifestations are different depending on who you are. How do we learn from this? By these kinds of discussions and by resolving to ourselves that we're going to not just listen, go out, have a coffee, forget about it, but we actually do something to move forward with these ideals that we claim to hold in high esteem. Thank you.
Abina, I will give you the final word. So, why you want to get into the notion of moral power?
Yeah, actually, if you look at the Chinese historical tradition, political culture, I think really I counsel, advocate this to non-Chinese as well. It's about moderation. Don't go to the extremes. You could have your own belief system, which we respect, but don't impose this on others in terms of so-called universal values. We had a long study. We checked these universal values, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly. Then you look at the Chinese society, even in Singapore, in Hong Kong, all these who use chopsticks, the number one priority is always public order. Yeah. In the United States, it's freedom of speech, although I doubt, because the United States is a politically correct society. Could you have real freedom of speech? Yeah. But that's another question. Yeah. So in terms of values, we should all respect each other's values and then try to see, because in the Chinese philosophy, it's about the opposites can coexist. It's like the disease cancer. The cancer cell is in the body of everyone, but you can live with it. You try to create a situation, it will not develop negatively in the wrong direction. Rather than the good must defeat evil, kill evil, and I represent the good, the best, others are just rubbish. So this will be a way how to create this new world. Now, China put forward this, the Belt and Road Initiative. It's a gigantic project, 10 times larger at least than, in terms of the investment than the Marshall Plan. But the overall guiding philosophy is discussing together, building together, benefiting together. If you are interested, please join in. If you're not interested, we don't care. Yeah. So that's the way we do it. Yeah, I think we talk about this Confucius' famous saying, the water represents people in the regime or political leaders as boats. We have to know really, honestly, how your people think, feel the pulse of the society. The Chinese government, with all its problems, is the one that uses far more opinion service than any governments in the world, than any institutions in China. Every cadre at every level wants to get promotion, opinion service. Yeah. So this is my humble suggestion.
Bernard, the final words are for you on the notion of moral power.
Yes, and about the other word you said, about greatness.
Yes.
About greatness. If you don't mind, I would like just to tell you about that. A few times in my life, I had the feeling to meet some people who were great. When? 3 sorts of circumstances. Number one, people who don't mind just their own business. This is the way of greatness. For example, social workers, people of NGO, working on the ground with a lot of commitment for a business which is not theirs. They are French, they are Americans, they are from wherever prosperous country, and they decide to devote a part of their life to a place of misery which is not their own business. For me, this is a sign of greatness. And I met a lot of people like this in many circumstances. I met also another way, another sort of people embodied by greatness. I remember in your country, Geliot-Gelev. I met him in 1990, just before he became president. I met Václav Havel before the revolution of 1989. I admired a lot an unnamed young man. So for me, this young Chinese boy, Václav Havel, Geliot-Gelev, confronting the pure force of the heavy weaponry of the police of state, this is greatness, this is bravery. And third situation where you can speak of greatness is people all over the world, in any place, in every possible situation, who have the courage to express an opinion which does not match with the sense of history or with the sense of what the majority of the people believe. And this is very important because you have, in the tradition of philosophy, a definition of the greatness which is exactly the contrary. Hegel says that a great man is a man who has the feeling, the sense, the nose, to feel the sense of history and to embed himself in the sense of history. This is for Hegel what is a great man. A great man is, for example, Napoleon. He knows that the time is the time of the universalization of the French Revolution and so on. I really believe exactly as the opposite. The real greatness consists in expressing a point of view, expressing an opinion, even if the sense of history does not seem to go in this sense. Even if the majority of your fellow citizens or of the rest of the world believe that it is a no-way, a no-exit path, this way of expressing something which seems to you true, which seems to you fair, even if it is at high cost, this is greatness. For example, remember Nelson Mandela. He was, for such a long time, he was alone. He was against the supposed sense of history, which was, everybody thought that the apartheid would last forever or for a long time. He stood on his point. And for this reason, he was a great man.
Can I make it? Because it's a great point. Because it goes to something that Bill said very important. And I agree very much with you. Now the most difficult is to dissent not against the majority, but against your own group. To be a dissenter in your Facebook page is becoming much more courageous than in the society as a whole. And I do believe this is where...
My idea is get rid of Facebook as soon as possible. My dear friends, it's 1 o'clock and it's time for lunch. Thank you so much. Thank you very, very much. Please give them a warm applause.